I have a whole heap of teenagers, and I am here to tell you that spending time with them will be one of the biggest blessings you will ever receive as a mother. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Raising Arrows podcast. I'm Amy Roberts from raisingarrows.net, and this is episode number 163, Spending Time with Your Teens. This is actually a question that was asked to me by a podcast listener. They wanted to know how to spend more time with their teens and how to relate to them as they are growing up and as you are also parenting other ages and stages. And so I want to address this because currently I have 4 teenagers. And so I am right in the middle of all of this. I have a 13-year-old, a 15-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 19-year-old. And those of you who know our story, if Emily were still with us here on this earth, she would be a 17-year-old. So I would have 5 in that category of teenager. Now, I lump all of these kids together because technically they are teenagers, but they are definitely not all in the same category of teenager. And that's something you need to keep in mind is what is the age of your teenagers. The 13 and 15-year-old, I can kind of lump them together. The 18 and 19-year-old, they are totally different and totally separate. And my relationship with them is much different compared to the 13 and 15-year-olds. So I don't know where you are in this journey. I don't know if you're just starting out with the teenage years and you're wanting to connect with them and stay connected with them as they grow up, or if you're at the end of these teenage years and you're just wondering if there's something more you could be doing to connect with your now young adults. But I will address all of that as we go through this podcast. The first thing I want to say is that you must respect the fact that your children are getting older. I've had this conversation with you before on previous podcasts, especially the ones where we talk about boys and their attitudes and girls and their attitudes, because as your children age, they are going to change. They're going to need more responsibilities and more privileges to match those responsibilities. And you're going to need to loosen up the apron strings and let them become their own people. This also means that they're not always going to come to you for advice or even for understanding how to live their life and their ideas and their values and things like that. They will have a foundation in your home, but as they get older and into those teenage years, they are going to start disconnecting from you a bit so that they can check out the world at large. And you want this. You want them to form their own identities outside of what they've been told year after year after year by you and your husband, because you want them to grow in their own faith. God does not have grandchildren, and therefore they need to come to their own saving faith and their own understanding of who they are in Christ. This is not something that you can force upon them. They have to come to that themselves. They have to humble themselves before the Lord on their own, not because you told them to. So as your children move into those teenage years, you really need to respect their individuality. And that is going to be kind of an overarching theme throughout this podcast, is respecting that individuality. How do you do that? And then how do you build that into a relationship with them where you're spending time with them and respecting and honoring who they are and their unique identity in Christ? So first of all, as your children are becoming teenagers and you are allowing them, new responsibilities and new privileges, you do have to have standards. However, be very, very careful that your standards are not arbitrary. Be very, very careful that your standards make sense, because teenagers can spot from a mile away when you are being hypocritical or something doesn't make sense. And as they get older, they are going to see more and more clearly where you are failing as a parent. And so you need to make sure that the standards and the rules that you are conveying to them and that you are putting on them as they get older make sense. This is also going to be a case-by-case thing. Not every teenager in your household necessarily needs to be treated the same. And we have had this conversation in our house that certain privileges don't come with age. They come with responsibility and showing that you are a responsible individual. And some children were responsible much earlier than others. And this particular privilege comes with that responsibility and showing that they are responsible in that way. So make sure that those standards and rules that you are putting forward are not arbitrary and that they make sense, because that's going to be kind of a crux of all of the time that you spend with your teenager, because they are going to spot those inconsistencies. And they are going to want to talk about it, or they're going to not want to talk about it and not really have a lot to do with you because they do spot those inconsistencies. So be very open. As they move into their teenage years, you need to be more and more open in your relationship with them, because you want them to come to you. You want them to talk to you, and you want them to carry this relationship with them into adulthood. And so this is a prime time to tell them you're sorry for certain standards and rules that maybe were arbitrary and you're realizing it now. Tell them the places that you've not necessarily done a great job with certain things. They are going to appreciate that honesty, and the fact that you also may need to offer an apology. They're going to appreciate those things as they get older, because they're going to start to see that mom and dad are not perfect. Okay, so now that we've kind of laid this foundation for your relationship with your teen, let's talk about how you can actually spend time with them. You are going to see, as your children grow into their teenage years, that they have interests and passions that are not necessarily the same as yours. In fact, you may even see such a sharp departure from what you used to do with your child to the things that they're interested in now that you may be a little mind blown and not real sure what to do about that. Perhaps they have an interest that you just don't understand. Don't just squash it immediately without learning about it, studying it, researching it. You may ask them to hold off on that for a bit while you do your research, but don't make everything a hill to die on. Make sure that you have looked things over and you're being reasonable about your expectations and your standards and your rules. And then consider joining them in some of the things that they're doing. Maybe not all in, we're going to play this video game together, but engage them in a conversation about it. What are they interested in about it? What do they like about it? What's some of the features of it that are really cool to them? Engage in that conversation. You will actually learn more about them and about the thing that you're curious about from just this conversation with them if you are truly interested in listening. So that is probably the number one way to spend time with your teen, is to simply listen and converse and be interested in what they are saying. They are growing into little adults, and they need to have this give and take in conversation to simply learn how to converse with others, but also to learn what it means to be an adult. And there are lots of things to be learned that can be done as a conversation. So just the fact that some kids really need help actually conversing, learning how to talk to other adults. Some kids need to learn how to be quiet and not talk all the time and monologue. Some kids need to know how to convey information and glean information from the other person they're talking to. So having these conversations are huge. And a great starting point is things that your teen is interested in. So focus in, listen, encourage, and get to know them just by having conversations. You can sit outside and have a conversation with them, a conversation around the dinner table, a conversation up in your bedroom after the smaller kids have gone to bed, a conversation in the car when you're headed to a dentist appointment. Just converse with them and actively engage them in conversation, and start with things they're passionate about anyway. They're much more likely to open up to you if it's something they are already interested in, especially if they think you might be interested in it as well and you're not just sitting in condemnation over them. I'd also encourage you to love them right where they are and then encourage them where they're going. So in other words, they are not perfect little human beings. You aren't either. And so you may see all these flaws in them, but you need to love your teens right where they are. And then guide and direct gently most of the time, unless it is just a red flag, they're going to jump out in front of a bus kind of situation. Just guide them gently. So you're encouraging them toward who they are going to become, not who you want them to become, who they are going to become. Because remember, they're individuals. They're not little yous. They are individuals, and they need to become the individual that God has created them to be. So you love them where they are. You see that they have flaws and you encourage them toward who they're going to become. You're not necessarily like harping on everything that they do. You're not criticizing everything that they do. You make sure that you tell them a multitude of times that you love them, because teenagers, especially the younger teenagers, like the tweens and then into like 13, 14, and even 15 to an extent, they are very confused and things are really weird in their world a lot of times because of hormones. You almost have to overdo it with encouraging them and loving on them and talking to them. And so I know for a lot of you, you've got other children and you're wondering, how am I going to do this? Well, one great way to do this is to simply take time away from everybody else, even if it's just 10 or 15 minutes. One thing we do is bring one child up at a time into our bedroom to have conversations, private conversations where they feel safe. They don't feel like anybody's going to laugh at them. They're not vying for our time. It is a time where we are just able to talk to them about things that interest them or things they're struggling with. And we have that one-on-one time, and that is a really great time to encourage them toward where they are going, love them where they are, and just get to know them. You know, it's funny, as they become teenagers, they do start to change so much that it almost feels like you don't know who they are. And so you need to actually spend more time figuring out these little human beings than you even did when they were little kids. This is that transition time from childhood to adulthood. And it is very confusing for everybody, parents included. And so you really have to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on in their world. And by doing this with bringing them up to your room or taking little drives. If you feel like you're not going to get the time away, take a short drive. Just go get some ice cream or just drive around a park and give yourself just a little bit of time and space to really get to know your teenager and just spend that quiet time with them. It does not have to be long and drawn out. Teenagers don't always have a great attention span. So just drive a little bit, 15 minutes at the most. Just take a drive, come back home, have these little pockets of conversation. Another thing you're going to need to realize is that your teenagers are not little kids. And so they aren't necessarily going to want to do the things that they wanted to do when they were little kids, and they're not necessarily going to want to do the things that you're doing with the other little kids. They are coming into their own, and they are going to have these different interests, and they're going to want to watch things that maybe you aren't necessarily super interested in your little kids watching. They're going to maybe want to listen to music that you aren't necessarily wanting your little kids to listen to. And I'm not talking about things that completely blow your standards out of the water. I'm talking about a change in the genre of music or a change in what they're watching. And maybe they want to watch something that's a little more grown up. They're tired of watching Bluey. Please respect that fact and try to implement some rules into the household where the little kids are not the determining factor for everything that goes on there. Don't be so child-centered in your household that your young adults or your teens are not able to start growing into adults. Implement a bedtime for your younger kids that does not allow for them to be in charge of the TV at night, or allow your teens to have time to watch something different or listen to something different. Set parameters for it, but don't just squash it all the time and be like, well, I've got little kids and you can't do that. I will tell you what, having little kids and then growing up into this world where I've got all these teenagers and young adults in the house, it has totally changed the dynamic of the household. And at first I really lamented that, and I mourned the fact that, we weren't watching these cartoons all the time, and we weren't watching all these, what I considered wholesome shows where that was all we watched. I felt like I was kind of drowning in this world between little kids and big kids, and I did not know how to handle it. So one thing that we ended up doing was getting a television in our room, in the master bedroom. And when we bring our teenagers up to watch something that's a little more adult, the atmosphere is more private. We can have those conversations in our room. We can talk about things that maybe we don't necessarily want to talk about in front of the other kids. And that way we can kind of help them to navigate these TV shows and movies that are a little more adult themed. And we actually started this in our homeschool. This was the way this all started. I got a TV in my room so that we could have lunch in my room and watch some of the shows that go along with our homeschooling. So some of the documentaries that I didn't feel like were necessarily appropriate for little kids. But this gave us some time with just my teens. We were eating lunch, we were watching the show, and it kind of set that precedent that they could come into my room. We could watch things together. And I wasn't just limiting them to only watching little kid shows day after day. I am not a huge fan of computers and devices and TVs in rooms when they are underage. I don't think that's a super safe practice for them. We actually do not allow that until they are of age and they are adults and they are ready to make those kinds of decisions. So I'm not advocating that you put a TV in their room or you let them have a computer in their room necessarily, but I am advocating that you have those available in your room where you are part of that time spent. And that is another great way to spend time with your teens, watching things that they wouldn't necessarily be watching with younger children and participating in the conversation and realizing that there are going to be things that initially you might be sort of shocked or scared of, conversations that come up due to things that you're watching together, but don't be afraid of those. Absolutely, again, have standards, have rules, but realize that as your children are moving into those teen years, things are going to change and your standards and your rules are going to change a little bit too, because there is a level of maturity that needs to come with age. We need to make sure we're not shying away from these really difficult conversations and that our children are actually seeing as they near adulthood what the real world is like. It's not really a good idea to shelter them entirely from what that world is like because it ends up backfiring all too often. And if you are interested in understanding more about this, I actually have a podcast on this topic. It's podcast number 102, Homeschool to College, Transitioning Your Teen. And in that podcast, I don't talk about academics necessarily. I'm talking more about helping them navigate your household versus the world outside your household. And my guess is those are two very different things, and you need to prepare them and help transition them into adulthood. So I know we've spent a lot of time kind of laying this foundation as far as spending time with your teens, and I've only given you a few ideas of how to actually practically spend time with your teens, but I think it's really important that you consider the fact that you need to find a way to relate to them, you need to love them, you need to encourage them, and you need to be careful that you're not hindering them from growing up, that you are actually encouraging them that direction. And so I'm just going to throw out now some quick ideas for what you could do to spend time with your teens. First of all, we mentioned, taking a drive and just driving around neighborhoods, going and getting a bite to eat. Take them shopping with you. Both of my older daughters and I have done this over the years. One of my older daughters, we would go out to eat and then we'd go shop. My daughter who's in the household now, who is 19 for a couple of years now, she and I have just gone out and shopped, and we've taken that time to talk and have these deep heart-to-hearts about things. That particular daughter and I also come upstairs and watch a show in the evening together, and we have a lot of laughs and we talk about things then. Another thing you can do that is not so much like spending physical time with your teen, but it's especially helpful if you have an introverted teen, is to share a mother-daughter journal where you write to her and she writes back, and you kind of share some deep thoughts there in that journal. This is especially helpful if they're just really struggling to speak to you about certain things, but they're better at writing. And so you could do a mother-daughter journal where you write something to her and you leave it in her room. She writes back to you and leaves it in your room. And this sometimes takes some of the pressure off of being face-to-face with hard conversations. Bring your teen into the kitchen with you while you cook. You can be teaching them practical skills while you have deep conversations. Do things that they enjoy doing. Go places that they enjoy going. Even if it's not really something you would want to do, go ahead and do some of those things with them to show them that you're interested in them. Do things with your teenagers that are things that you would typically do with friends. Go to coffee with them, go shopping with them, go to craft fairs with them, go to certain events with them that you would typically take a friend with you. Try taking your teen instead. Because you are actually moving from that really hands-on physical parenting role to that mental and emotionally taxing parenting role that ends up creating this friend in your child. And you begin to learn yourself how to navigate an adult-child friendship. And that starts in their teen years as you get to know them more and as they get to know you more and the conversations are deeper and there are things that you didn't talk about when they were little kids. You're growing in that relationship, and hopefully by the time they get to adulthood, you have built a really great lasting friendship, not just a parent-child relationship, but a friendship that's deep and meaningful. And doing things with them that you would do with friends helps to build that. And that is probably a really good rule of thumb for you to think about is what makes for a really good friendship? What do you consider to be a great friend? Someone who listens to you, but also needs you from time to time. Someone who shares a few similar interests, but not necessarily everything. Someone who likes to be with you. Someone who enjoys spending time with you. As you build this relationship with your teens, start considering what you find to be delightful and wonderful in a friend, and you become that for your teenager. Obviously, the best friends are not the ones who affirm you in everything that you do. The best friends challenge you, but not all the time. You want them to be loving and gracious. And so be that towards your teenager as they grow from 13, 14, 15, all the way up into young adulthood. You will not regret the time that you spend getting to know your teenager, even in little bitty snippets of time. It will lay the foundation for a lasting relationship with an open door of communication and the two of you leaning into a new way of relating to each other. I pray a blessed relationship between you and all of your children, no matter their ages. Have a fantastic week, my friends, and we will see you next time on the Raising Arrows podcast, your home for all things large family homemaking and homeschooling. Bye-bye.